Good evening, everybody. I've just got to set this clock so I don't, because I've got a tendency to just go on indefinitely, so I'll constrain what I say. Oh, yours got that, yes. It's lovely to be here. It's such a great big crowd. I'm sort of always reminded when I'm in front of a big crowd to get my language right, because I was always reminded of a quote from Ronald Reagan, who gets up in front of this great big crowd, and he says, it's fantastic to be here, to see such a dense crowd in front of me. So I don't want to say any such thing this evening, obviously. Look, it is Friday evening. There is a bar later on, so I don't want to get in between you lot and the wine tasting for too long, but it's great to be back at this conference. I haven't been here for 5 or 6 years. I think we were just talking beforehand when we had a session on the dignity of work and the workers' rights and the trade union movement. I was very fortunate enough to do some work with you a few years ago, so it's great to be back with you. And it does feel like a bit of respite care, actually, because arguably the last couple of weeks, for all of us, I think, what we've experienced or seen on the TV in Parliament globally as well, across Europe, is a sort of shakedown and a collapse of certain things that we assumed. The Prime Minister, for example, the collapse of the internal disciplines within the two major political parties, voting to leave Europe. Last night, what we saw witnessing across the terrible tragedy in Nice, you have a sense that the rules are being ripped up. There's a sense of bewilderment about what's going on. There's a sense of turbulence and unpredictability, and people, I think, are very vulnerable, and they want to start to rethink what all this is about. So I think it's really timely to have this conversation over this weekend, because that is exactly how I feel as an MP, actually. And that's where the personal stuff comes in, because I'll be fairly blunt where I come from, actually. I come from an Irish Catholic working class Labour tradition, and that was a bit of a job lot, you know, that all sort of went together. My family came from the west of Ireland, just like my wife's family all come from the west of Ireland in the 50s. Worked very hard, brought up big families, got 5 brothers, 5 in ours, and we were brought up in a very strong ethical framework around church and duty and obligation and a shared humanity to one another, and that was the foundations upon which we were all brought up. Now, naturally, for me, the route out from that was to join the Labour Party. For my middle brother, it was to join the Carmelites, but it was all of a piece, you know. It was all out of the same sense of upbringing, duty and obligation to one another, and a sense of humanity that transcended our physiological characteristics, you know. It went to something deeper about what it was about to be human. And that's what politics was about. I remember Tawney once said that there's 2 strands of socialism, ethical traditions and economic traditions, and I was very much from the ethical tradition. All my mother's sisters, they travelled all around the world as they migrated from the west of Ireland, and I spent quite a few years going around the world working and being brought up by some of my aunts and uncles and cousins, and I got involved in the building industry, and I got involved in the builders workers movement, and I was a trade union activist and a representative primarily for the Builders Labourers Federation in Australia, and that's how I got formally involved in the Labour movement. But I'd always been a sort of Labour guy, you know. Came back eventually, went to college, did some university courses, did a PhD, taught in a few universities, and then got involved formally with the Labour Party just before we went to power in 97 for a few years. And after 97, I was very lucky to go into Downing Street and work on the introduction of the national minimum wage. It was a fantastic couple of years. I got slightly frustrated by the end of it, and I was very fortunate to become the MP for Dagenham then. And Dagenham at the time was going through, from about 2002, 2003, the fastest changing demographic changes anywhere in the country. Partly because it's the cheapest housing market in Greater London, so you see this extraordinary migration of people into Dagenham, into London, and then within London into the search for cheap housing, just like my family had done, just like, you know, scores of migrant families have done. And it became really, really lively, partly because the far right were involved, and at one stage we had 12 out of 51 people on the council were BNP councillors, so we had some very, very intense battles over the character of the local community and extremism, where other far right groups were coming in and scavenging around, trying to pitch one community against against another. And it got you back to some of the things how I was brought up, that shared humanity, that sense that there is more that pulls us together than separates us apart. And the duty is to go to that sense of common good, that sense of how we can prosper and nurture as families within a shared community. So that was sort of entirely consistent with how I was brought up in terms of the role of what I saw the Labour Party or socialism to be about. But I always had a sort of slight growing detachment from Labour in government over the years, especially from about 2006 to 2010. I got so frustrated actually when Jon Cruddas and Tony Blair stood down. I was a candidate to be deputy leader of the party, basically because I thought the party lost its way really and wanted it to change direction. That didn't work out. And then after we lost in 2010, I thought, which was arguably one of the greatest defeats in the Labour Party history, we'd become remote and instrumental, and we'd lost that ethic, which I always thought was the hallmark of socialism, actually, with the Labour Party. From 2010 to 2015, my job was around policy, to pull together the manifesto for the 2015 election, and that didn't work too well either, given the election results. But the point being is there was a recurring theme through all that sort of personal journey in terms of my own political disposition, was that sense of a growing tension between me and my own party, as I thought it sort of lost its way or lost that ethical character to what I thought it was all about, right? A sense, a soul, if you want, became remote, quite transactional, preoccupied with money rather than some of the deeper issues about our shared humanity, and it lost its essential character, you know. So that was a sort of growing frustration to me, and so over the last years I've got really interested in the question of a deeper sense of what politics is for, actually, and how it relates to all the political parties, because arguably, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, we've got a crisis in all of the main political parties. So I think we have to go to deeper questions, and that's where I sort of have tried to reconcile my role as an MP and my local community in Parliament with also some of the reasons I got into it in the first place, in terms of what politics is about. So that got me into some of these questions of deeper philosophical traditions. And let me put it quite bluntly. When we talk about a national justice and peace network, what do we actually mean by the word justice? That seems to me to be a pretty good place to start in terms of what does it actually mean? I suggest to you that what is needed across the country, arguably globally, is a renewed public philosophy built on a renewed sense of what is justice about. And that means we have to excavate different traditions within and between political parties, but also we have to excavate different faith-based and spiritual traditions which have always been preoccupied with the questions of justice. Because we hear an awful lot of talk about social justice or the just society, but what we don't do is reconnect with the foundations or the fundamental propositions within that conversation. Right? And that's what I think we need to do over the next years. And I think the Justice and Peace Network is in a great position to look through that, because it comes with an awful lot of memory and knowledge, right, in this space. And that's what needs to be sort of built up and worked on. Let me put this fairly bluntly. Social democracy was the post-war political philosophy that attempted to constrain capitalism, build the welfare state, democratise our society. But it has failed. It's failed to moderate the power of capital. Reagan, Thatcher pushed back against social democracy, that post-war settlement, and dismantled a lot of it. What came after Reagan and Thatcher was Blair, Clinton, Schroeder, but their objective was just to moderate it. It wasn't really to change the architecture of capitalism. It actually just rode a lot of economic growth. My criticism of the Labour government was we had 15 years of economic growth, 60 quarters of it, and basically we just had a compact with the banks, with finance capital, to skim off a bit of the money and recycle it back to the poorer elements of society, primarily through tax credits, but we didn't challenge that fundamental architecture of modern capitalism in the interests of the poor, to make a deeper, democratic, fairer, equal society. Consequently, when 2008 came, the music stopped, the growth stopped. We had no response because we were partly culpable to creating that system that collapsed. And since then, social democracy or Labour or social democratic traditions have had very little to say. And that's partly why they're all in crisis now. If you look around the globe, social democratic or left of centre parties are in freefall. They've got very little to say about the future. And again, that's why we need to return to some fundamental questions. Now, I would just put it this way, right? If you look across the whole of political philosophy, when you think about questions of justice, you basically get to three different approaches, right? The first one sees questions of justice as being questions of utility, right? Now, philosophically, that's usually called utilitarianism, which means maximising the benefits to the maximum amount of people. But it basically means a form of equality, which is about giving poorer people money, right? So it's about redistributing money, and it becomes preoccupied with financial transactions, right? A good example is Labour, when it fought the last election, was on a cost of living crisis, and it sought to give poor, get rid of the bedroom tax, increase the minimum wage, increase some of the tax credits, which in and of themselves I thought were good things, but they didn't go to deeper questions of trying to rethink what a good or a just society is. So it became quite transactional, money-centred, about shifting bits of money around. And if you look around the history of philosophical thought, that question of utilitarianism as the basis of equality or distributive justice is the dominant approach to governing society. Now, that has a lot to say about money and GDP, but very little to say about everything else. I always remember a Bobby Kennedy quote where he said, GDP, it tells you everything apart from the thing, it measures everything apart from that is important in our lives. Do you see what I mean? It's all about economics rather than the question of what is a good or a just existence. But that is the dominant way of ordering society. Now, there is a second approach to ordering society, which is less interested in utility and more interested in rights. Now, on the right has approach to freedom, which is about the libertarian approaches to freedom, which is about cutting away the state, allowing people to live individual lives. Ayn Rand being the classic philosopher. On the left, especially in the 60s, we saw forms of rights-based models of justice, which is about using the law to guarantee these rights for individuals, and the state becomes neutral about what is a good life. It is neutral about how people should live. And these two approaches, the money or the utility-based approach and the rights-based approach, have dominated political debate. They have basically informed how all the different parties govern, what are the philosophical characteristics upon which they think that society should be ordered. Because that's basically what justice is about. Justice is about different approaches to how society should be ordered. One based on money and utility, the second based on people's rights. But there is a third tradition, which is often ignored, which is much more ancient, which is based on not utility or freedom and rights, but about virtues. And that is basically, what are the virtues that we want to nurture as a society so that people can live more fulfilling, rewarding lives? What virtues do we want to, as a society, say, we will promote these? We will create institutions that nurture and incubate these virtues that cumulatively add up to the common good. What type of citizens do we want to create? So, the virtues you might think about are how we can create more compassionate citizens, how we can create wiser citizens, how we can create people of greater integrity, humility, prudence, wisdom, righteousness. These virtues become the drivers of public conversation, public policy. So, for example, education policy becomes less preoccupied about creating more efficient economic actors, but more about creating wiser, younger people. That's what we should order society around in our education policies. Similarly, in terms of health policy, it shouldn't be just treating people. It should be about creating stronger, resilient mental health and well-being in our citizens. And you can rethink public policy around your different approaches to justice, whether it's about money transfers, the rights people have, or the virtues you want to nurture. And if you look through the whole history of political philosophy, it basically boils down to those three traditions. Actually, the history of all political parties can be seen as a contest within different political parties about which approach dominates. So in terms of the Labour Party, right, the history of the Labour Party really is a history of the virtue-based traditions losing, really. I mean, they created the Labour Party. Christian socialists created the Labour Party. It owed more to Methodism than it did to Marxism in the classic phrase of Alan Wilson. But slowly, that approach that characterised the great Keir Hardie or George Lansbury was exiled, if you want, where it became preoccupied with, in the 30s, economics, and in the 60s, rights, at the expense of a virtue-based approach to politics. And actually, consequently, I think Labour has lost its soul. It's literally lost its soul, it's lost its ethic, because it's lost the virtues of approach to justice, which was the hallmark of its creation, actually. And similarly, you see how liberalism, or economic liberalism, has overtaken conservatism, or one-nation conservatism in a lot of the contest in the modern Conservative Party. So basically, you begin then to scan out different approaches to justice, which informs different approaches to how we order society. And I think at a moment of crisis, like we're witnessing now, we should go back to those fundamentals of how we consider alternative approaches to justice in terms of how we order society. Now, the great thing for Catholic social teaching, or social justice and peace traditions, is that you've worked with these categories in a virtue-based approach in terms of the history and the teaching within these different traditions. So you're very well equipped to re-enter the public square. Let me give you a couple of examples. The best two pieces of material I saw before the last election were the two letters from both the Catholic and the Church of England as open letters to politicians before the election, which were all based around the notion of the common good, were virtue-based in terms of working across ancient traditions within their different religions. But consequently, they were distributed to politicians. The politicians picked them up and could not answer them because they literally had different language to the ones that dominate politics in Westminster or wherever, which are all based around money-based or utility-based traditions or rights-based models of justice. We have lost the ability to converse around questions of virtue, human well-being, human self-realisation, what it is to live a good life, what it is to build a just, good society. Politicians now don't use these categories. They are tone deaf when it comes to these sorts of conversations. And I think that partly accounts for a sense of crisis in the public square now. Let me give you an example, and this is slightly more controversial. I remember in January 2014, Nigel Farage said in an interview on the Today programme, he said there are certain things that are more important than money, right? Which I thought that was a fantastic thing to say, because it echoed the Bobby Kennedy thing about GDP measures everything apart from that which is important in our lives, you know, the quality of our lives, the love amongst our family, the play of our children, you know, are not captured by these economic aggregates, these GDP calculations. And Farage was beginning to go to these questions of deeper questions rather than just transactions. And he won out, partly because the whole counter-argument to him was all about economics. It was all about the fear, the economic consequences of leaving the European Union. And he was talking a totally different language at times, which had real power and grip. You might not agree with it, but it had a different texture to the conversation. And I think And unfortunately, to my mind, his party used it to express a sense of loss and betrayal and grievance, rather than using that sort of language for a more optimistic, hopeful story about national renewal. And that, to me, is the task at hand in terms of politics. And it gets back to how I was brought up, really, because I was brought up in a very virtue-based tradition of politics. My mother wouldn't have characterised it as that, but it was a sense of your duty and obligation to one another as a basis for you living a good life, to you prosper in terms of your shared humanity and your obligation in terms of your actions as a human being as part of a shared common humanity. And that, I think, is the nature of the conversation that we need to reintroduce now. What is it to live a good life? What is a just society? What is our approach more fundamentally to justice? What is our approach to rebuilding the public realm so that we can nurture the human characteristics that allow people to fulfill or live a rewarding life, to be human? Václav Havel, the great Czech playwright, used to talk about parts of politics exiling parts of our humanity. They fail to allow us to express ourselves as human beings because they become technocratic, money obsessed. And the role of politics has to change so that we can bring out those parts of the human condition that modern neoliberalism or capitalism exile. And that seems to me to be a very good departure point in terms of politics. And it does reduce itself to quite simple propositions. Let me give you an example. Karen Armstrong, in her fantastic History of Religions, she always uses the thing to express the thing that holds together all basic religions. Hillel's Golden Rule. You've come across this, where she always says how some cynical non-believers come up to the Rabbi Hillel and they say, if you can stand on one leg and recite the scriptures, we'll sign up to your religion. So he stands on one leg and he says, do not do unto others as you'd not have them do to you. The rest is commentary. Which is a really interesting thing. The thing that unites all religions is that sense of duty and obligation to one another. You can strip down to some fundamental basic propositions and the rest is commentary. And I think that expresses it very well, because there's a secularised element of that, expressed in politicians like Clement Attlee and others who held to that notion of the common good and a sense of duty and obligation to one another. They didn't have to be codified within a specific religious expression, but talked to that deeper humanity. And I think we can retrieve the political space by returning to these exiled, virtue-based traditions that lie deep within us, actually, because I think when you are, because we go back, they are exiled. They are not expressed in the political space at the moment, but at a time of crisis, where people are yearning for something deeper from their representatives and a sense of a national story that is hopeful, optimistic, and forward-looking. And it is one that is where hope dominates fear, then I think a return to a virtue-based model of justice is ready-made for us to rehabilitate the political sphere, actually. And I think it goes back to fundamentals about how we were all taught. And the Catholic tradition is the best. Catholic social teaching, with its references to the dignity of labour, to that sense of the common good, subsidiarity, the preference for the poor, all of this is foundational in terms of resetting the renewed politics of the common good today. So I'm very optimistic, strangely enough. My favourite political philosopher was a guy called Rainham, and he said to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And over the last couple of weeks, despair has become convincing, actually. But if you go to these traditions, if you, through this course of this weekend, excavate a virtue-based approach to politics, I think we can literally alter the political conversation in this country, because I think the country's crying out for it, actually. I really do, in terms of, you see over the last couple of weeks, there's canyons being built across our society, young and old, class-based ones. And we've got to transcend them and the physiological characteristics of this by going to something deeper, that notion of the common good. A virtue-based approach to politics is the future political conversation built around the notion of the common good. So therefore, I'm very optimistic, and my mother will be very pleased about this, because this is literally how I ended up joining the Labour. It takes me right back to basics, and it's a very optimistic time, paradoxically, given all that confronts us as we try and navigate the complexity of the modern world and what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. So we can make hope possible rather than despair convincing if we use some of the traditions that we were brought up with and present them in the public square and push back against that liberal rights-based models that question the very validity of faith-based or spiritual contributions in the public square. Actually, the future belongs to a virtue-based Catholic social teaching